What began as cruel laughter at what everyone assumed was an elaborate Halloween costume ended with a decorated green beret dropping to his knees in the middle of a crowded convention center. Because the woman they had been mocking for the past hour wasn't wearing a costume at all, preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Portland Comic Convention sprawled across the Oregon Convention Center like a kaleidoscope explosion of pop culture, transforming the normally sterile business venue into a wonderland of fantasy and imagination. Cosplayers wandered the aisles in elaborate recreations of their favorite characters, from intricately detailed anime warriors to movie-accurate superhero suits that had taken months to craft. The air buzzed with excitement, camera clicks, and the constant hum of thousands of conversations, mixing together into a symphony of shared enthusiasm. Saturday afternoon was peak attendance time, when families with children mixed with serious collectors and costume enthusiasts created a dense crowd that moved through the vendor halls like colorful rivers. The lighting was harsh and commercial, designed for trade shows rather than the theatrical atmosphere that would have better suited the fantastical displays. But somehow the enthusiasm of the attendees transformed even the fluorescent glare into something magical. Security guards in their standard black polo shirts moved through the crowds with practiced ease, their eyes trained to spot potential problems before they escalated. Most of their work involved lost children, minor disputes over booth space, and the occasional overzealous fan who got too close to a celebrity guest. It was generally peaceful work, the kind of assignment that seasoned security professionals considered a welcome break from more serious venues. That's what made the woman walking through the main entrance so noticeable. Not because she stood out in the sea of costumes and creativity, but because she seemed to exist in a completely different space from everyone around her. While others moved with the excited energy of people on vacation from reality, she walked with a deliberate economy of motion that spoke of muscle memory and professional training. She appeared to be in her early 30s, average height, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation military bun that was so precise it could have been used as a training example. Her uniform was what caught people's attention initially, not because it was elaborate or fantastical, but because it was so meticulously correct in every detail. The digital camouflage pattern was current military issue, not the outdated designs that most costume shops carried. The blousing of her trousers over her combat boots was textbook perfect, and every crease looked like it had been pressed with mathematical precision. But it was the way she wore the uniform that made some people look twice and others dismiss her entirely. There was no swagger, no conscious effort to display the various patches and insignia that decorated the fabric. She moved through the convention center with the same bearing she would have used walking across any military installation. Professional and unremarkable in the way that career soldiers learn to be when they wanted to blend into their environment. The badges and patches covering her uniform told a story that most of the convention attendees couldn't read. The combat patch on her right shoulder indicated overseas deployment. The various service ribbons across her left chest represented years of military service and achievements that were meaningless to civilians but would have made career military personnel stop and take notice. The unit patches and tabs suggested specialized training and assignments that were uncommon even within military circles. Most telling of all was the way she carried herself. Not with the stiff formality of someone playing dress-up, but with the unconscious confidence of someone who had earned the right to wear every thread of fabric and every piece of metal on her uniform. Her posture was straight without being rigid, alert without being tense, and she moved through the crowded space with the situational awareness of someone who had been trained to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. The convention badge hanging from her uniform identified her as Captain Sarah Morrison, but she had paid for a civilian ticket like everyone else. No special military discount, no veteran recognition program. Just a woman who wanted to spend her weekend off enjoying the same pop culture that helped her decompress from a job that most people couldn't imagine. She paused at a booth, selling military-themed memorabilia, run by an enthusiastic collector who specialized in historical uniforms and equipment. The booth owner, a middle-aged man with soft hands and an extensive knowledge of military history gleaned from books and documentaries, looked up from organizing his display of reproduction medals and patches. "Great costume," he said with genuine appreciation, his eyes taking in the details of her uniform. "Really authentic looking. Must have cost a fortune to get all those details right. The patches alone probably set you back hundreds of dollars." Sarah nodded politely, her expression neutral. "Thank you. I've got some accessories that would really complete the look." The vendor continued, gesturing toward a case filled with various military items. Combat knives, dog tags, even some night vision goggles that looked totally real. Course, they're just props, but they photograph great. The conversation was interrupted by a group of teenage cosplayers who had been circulating through the convention, taking photos with attendees in elaborate costumes. They approached with the confident enthusiasm of people who had already posed with dozens of characters that day, their phones ready and their energy infectious. "Oh my God, your military costume is incredible," one of them gushed, already positioning herself for a selfie. "The attention to detail is insane. You must have spent months putting this together." Sarah found herself surrounded by the group, their excitement genuine but their assumptions complete. They posed around her like she was a prop in their convention experience, making jokes about playing soldier and discussing the technical aspects of what they assumed was an elaborate costume construction project. "The camouflage pattern looks so real," another teenager commented, reaching out to touch the fabric of her sleeve. "What kind of material did you use? It feels exactly like the real thing." The teenager's enthusiasm was harmless enough, but it attracted attention from other convention attendees who began to gather around what they perceived as an impressively detailed military costume display. A small crowd formed, with people taking photos and making comments about the authenticity of every visible detail. Sarah stood patiently in the center of it all, neither encouraging nor discouraging the attention, simply enduring it with the same professional tolerance she'd learned to apply to countless other uncomfortable situations. That's when Marcus Webb noticed the commotion. Webb was a 26-year-old aspiring filmmaker who attended conventions primarily to network and promote his independent projects, most of which involved what he considered realistic depictions of military action. He had spent countless hours researching military procedures through YouTube videos and action movies, and considered himself something of an expert on military authenticity and entertainment. He pushed through the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed his limited research gave him authority to speak on military matters. Webb wore an expensive camera around his neck and carried himself with the self-important air of someone who thought convention attendance was serious business rather than weekend entertainment. "Excuse me," Webb announced loudly, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who enjoyed being the center of attention. "I hate to break up the photo session, but there are some serious problems with this costume." The crowd turned toward him, and Sarah remained motionless, her expression unchanged. Webb began circling her like a predator who had found easy prey, pointing out what he perceived as inconsistencies and errors in her uniform. "First off," he declared with theatrical authority, "those combat boots are totally wrong for the time period you're trying to represent. The tread pattern wasn't introduced until 2018, but some of those patches are from earlier deployments. Any real military person would know that." Several people in the crowd nodded as if they understood what he was talking about, though most had no frame of reference for military equipment or procedures. Webb was encouraged by the attention and continued his critique with growing confidence. "And look at this," he said, pointing toward her chest. The ribbon rack is completely out of regulation. The spacing is wrong, the precedence order is mixed up, and half of those ribbons weren't even available to female personnel during the time frame suggested by the deployment patches. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent. Webb interpreted her lack of response as validation of his expertise and pressed his advantage. Plus, and this is the dead giveaway, he continued, his voice rising with excitement at his own cleverness. Real military personnel don't just wear their dress uniforms to comic conventions. This is stolen valor territory, people. This is someone pretending to be something they're not for attention and free drinks. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, suddenly uncertain about whether they should continue taking photos or distance themselves from what might be an embarrassing situation. The teenagers who had initially been so enthusiastic about posing with Sarah now looked confused and slightly guilty, as if they had been caught participating in something inappropriate. Webb was just getting started. He pulled out his phone and began recording, apparently planning to create content around what he saw as an opportunity to expose fraud and demonstrate his own expertise. "Ma'am," he said with exaggerated politeness, the kind that was clearly intended to be insulting, "would you mind explaining how you earned all these medals and ribbons? Because frankly, the combination you're wearing suggests either an impossibly distinguished career or someone who bought a bunch of military surplus items and arranged them randomly." A convention security guard, attracted by the growing crowd and raised voices, approached the group. Officer David Chen was a retired police officer who worked convention security to supplement his pension. He was generally competent at crowd control, but had no particular expertise in military matters, which made him susceptible to the confidence with which Webb was presenting his accusations. "What's the situation here?" Chen asked, his tone professional, but clearly assuming that Webb, as the person making accusations, was probably in the right. "This woman is wearing what appears to be a military uniform with decorations that don't make sense," Webb explained, clearly enjoying his role as expert. Witness: "I'm concerned about stolen valor laws and the message this sends to real veterans." Chun looked Sarah over with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with thousands of minor disputes over the years. He saw a woman in what appeared to be a military costume at a convention where elaborate costumes were expected. Webb's confident presentation of military knowledge that Chun couldn't verify or contradict made the security guard inclined to take his concerns seriously. "Ma'am," Chun said to Sarah, his tone polite but carrying the weight of official authority, "do you have any documentation that would verify your military service? We've had some complaints about the authenticity of your uniform." The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the drama and the possibility of witnessing either a confrontation or an embarrassing exposure. People held up phones to record what they expected might become a viral moment, either of someone being caught in an elaborate lie or of an innocent person being unfairly harassed. Sarah reached slowly into her pocket, her movements deliberate and non-threatening, clearly aware that she was being recorded by multiple devices. She produced a military identification card and handed it to the security guard without comment. Chun examined the ID briefly, but his lack of experience with military credentials meant he couldn't distinguish between authentic and fake documents. Webb, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise further, leaned over to examine the card as well. "Anyone can buy fake military IDs online," Webb declared dismissively. "The real question is whether she can answer basic military questions that any real service member would know." Webb positioned himself closer to Sarah, clearly relishing his role as investigator and expert. The crowd pressed in around them, creating an impromptu arena where everyone expected to witness either a dramatic confession or a satisfying takedown of someone they now suspected of fraud. "Let's start simple," Webb announced, pulling up what appeared to be a military knowledge quiz on his phone. What's the standard march cadence for infantry units? What's the maximum effective range of an M4 carbine? When was the last major restructuring of Army Special Operations Command? Sarah looked at him with the kind of patience that came from dealing with countless briefings by people who confused enthusiasm with knowledge. Her silence seemed to fuel Webb's confidence that he was exposing someone who couldn't answer basic military questions. "See?" Webb said to the crowd, gesturing dramatically. "Real military personnel would rattle off those answers without thinking. The fact that she's not responding proves this is all fake." Officer Chun shifted uncomfortably, caught between his duty to maintain order and his lack of expertise to evaluate the situation properly. The growing crowd was becoming a crowd control issue, but he couldn't determine whether Webb's accusations had merit or whether he was witnessing harassment of an innocent convention attendee. "Ma'am," Chun said to Sarah, "maybe you could just answer a few questions to clear this up. It would help resolve the situation." What Sarah did next surprised everyone except those who understood military bearing under pressure. Instead of becoming defensive or angry, she straightened slightly and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the crowd without being raised. "My name is Captain Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, United States Army, service number 987654321. I am not required to justify my service to civilians at a comic convention, and I will not participate in amateur interrogations by individuals with no authority to demand such information." Her response was delivered with the kind of professional calm that military personnel learned when dealing with situations that required escalation without backing down. Every word was measured, clear, and carried the weight of someone accustomed to speaking with authority. Webb, however, interpreted her refusal to play his game as further evidence of fraud. "Real soldiers don't hide behind technicalities," he declared. "If you earned all those ribbons and patches, you'd be proud to talk about your service, not defensive about proving it." The crowd's mood was shifting in ways that reflected their individual biases and experiences. Some people were beginning to feel uncomfortable watching what might be harassment of a veteran, while others were caught up in the drama and eager to see the confrontation reach its conclusion. The teenagers who had initially wanted photos were now filming everything, unclear whether they were documenting justice or injustice. A woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone with personal experience. "My husband served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and he says real veterans don't owe anyone explanations about their service, especially not in public places." Webb turned toward her with irritation. "Your husband obviously never dealt with stolen valor cases. This is exactly how fake veterans behave when they're called out. Real ones have nothing to hide." The argument was beginning to fracture the crowd into factions, with some supporting Webb's investigation and others growing increasingly uncomfortable with the public interrogation. Officer Chun realized that the situation was escalating beyond his ability to manage effectively and reached for his radio to call for backup. That's when Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez arrived at the edge of the crowd. Rodriguez was attending the convention with his 12-year-old daughter, enjoying a rare weekend away from his duties with the 75th Ranger Regiment. He was dressed in civilian clothes, trying to blend in and simply be a father at a comic convention rather than a soldier. Rodriguez had been drawn to the commotion by the raised voices and the sight of what appeared to be someone in military uniform being confronted by a crowd. His initial assumption was that he might witness another unfortunate stolen valor incident, something he'd encountered before and found personally offensive as someone who had earned his own decorations through years of dangerous deployments. But as he moved closer and got a clear view of the woman at the center of the controversy, something made him pause. It wasn't her posture, though that was notably professional. It wasn't her uniform, though every detail appeared regulation correct. It was something more subtle, something that civilian observers wouldn't notice, but that made Rodriguez's trained eye focus more carefully. The way she held her hands, the unconscious positioning of her feet, the manner in which her eyes swept the crowd, cataloging faces and exit routes without appearing to do so. These were behaviors ingrained by training that went beyond basic military service, the kind of situational awareness and tactical thinking that were developed in specialized units. Rodriguez began studying the patches and insignia visible on her uniform with the experienced eye of someone who knew what different military decorations actually meant. Most civilians looked at military ribbons and saw colorful decorations. Rodriguez saw a story of service that was starting to make his pulse quicken with recognition. The combat patch on her right shoulder indicated deployment with the 5th Special Forces Group. The tab above her unit patch was partially obscured by the crowd, but Rodriguez could make out enough to recognize specialized qualification, insignia that were not commonly worn or easily obtained through military surplus stores. More significantly, he noticed details that Webb and the crowd had missed entirely. The subdued nature of her decorations suggested recent deployment experience. The specific combination of ribbons indicated not just military service, but combat operations in multiple theaters. And there was something else, a small detail that made Rodriguez's breath catch in his throat. Partially concealed beneath her left collar was a small pin that most people would dismiss as another piece of military jewelry. But Rodriguez recognized it immediately as something that couldn't be purchased in any surplus store or replicated by costume enthusiasts. It was a Ranger tab, not the standard version that most people associated with Army Rangers. This was the subdued, operational variant that was only issued to personnel actively serving in specific units. Rodriguez felt his heart rate increase as he processed what he was seeing. The combination of insignia wasn't random or decorative. It told the story of someone who had progressed through increasingly elite levels of military service, earning qualifications that required not just completion of training programs, but sustained exceptional performance in operational environments. The Special Forces tab above her unit patch was authentic, bearing the wear patterns that came from actual use rather than display. The combat infantryman badge positioned above her ribbons indicated direct engagement with enemy forces, something that couldn't be faked or approximated. But it was the small details that confirmed Rodriguez's growing suspicion about who this woman really was. Her jump wings were at the basic paratrooper qualification that many soldiers earned during their careers. These were master paratrooper wings, indicating hundreds of successful jumps under various conditions. More significantly, Rodriguez could see the tiny addition that indicated she was qualified for halo operations, high altitude, low opening jumps that were used for covert insertion into hostile territory. While Webb continued his amateur investigation and the crowd pressed closer with their cameras, Rodriguez began moving through the throng of people with the deliberate purpose of someone who had suddenly understood the gravity of the situation. His daughter followed behind him, confused by her father's sudden change in demeanor, but trust in his judgment enough to stay close. "The ribbons are in the wrong order," Webb was declaring to the crowd, consulting his phone for reference images he'd found online. "And look at this bronze star. Real bronze stars have specific design elements that this one is missing. I'm telling you, this whole thing is fraudulent." Rodriguez reached the inner circle of the crowd just as Webb was reaching for one of Sarah's ribbons, apparently intending to examine it more closely. Without thinking, Rodriguez's hand shot out and caught Webb's wrist with enough force to stop his movement, but not enough to cause pain. "Don't touch her ribbons," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people instinctively step back. "Don't touch any part of her uniform." Webb turned toward Rodriguez with irritation, clearly annoyed at being interrupted during what he saw as his moment of triumph. "Look, buddy, I appreciate that you want to defend someone, but this woman is clearly wearing a fake uniform. Someone needs to call her out on it." Rodriguez released Webb's wrist and studied Sarah's face for the first time during the confrontation. What he saw there confirmed everything the insignia had told him. Her eyes held the particular depth that came from seeing things that most people never had to witness. There was a calmness in her bearing that spoke of someone who had faced genuinely dangerous situations and learned to maintain composure under pressure. "What's your unit?" Rodriguez asked Sarah directly, his tone respectful but carrying the weight of someone who would know whether her answer was legitimate. "5th Special Forces. Group, 3rd Battalion," Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. "ODA 595. Rodriguez felt the world shift slightly around him. Operational Detachment Alpha 595 wasn't just any Special Forces unit. It was a team that had gained legendary status within the special operations community for operations that most people would never hear about. If this woman had served with ODA 595, she wasn't just a veteran, she was part of an elite group that had operated in some of the most dangerous environments in the world. "Your deployment rotation?" Rodriguez continued, needing confirmation of details that only someone with actual experience would know. "Afghanistan 2019 to 2021, Iraq 2022, Syria, classified duration." Sarah answered without hesitation, providing information that could be verified through military channels, but wouldn't be known to someone creating a false identity. Webb, growing frustrated that the conversation had moved beyond his expertise, interrupted loudly. "Anyone can memorize unit names and deployment dates. I could look that stuff up online in 5 minutes. The real test is whether she knows actual military procedures and protocols." Rodriguez turned toward Webb with an expression that made several people in the crowd step backward. His voice, when he spoke, carried the controlled intensity of someone who was struggling to maintain professional composure. "The real test," Rodriguez said slowly, "is whether you have any idea what those ribbons actually represent. Because if you did, you'd know that the bronze star she's wearing has a V device, which means it was awarded for valor in combat. And the silver star above it, it means she distinguished herself by gallantry in action against an armed enemy." The crowd had gone silent, sensing that the dynamic of the confrontation had fundamentally changed. Webb looked uncertain for the first time, his confidence shaken by Rodriguez's obvious military knowledge and the intensity of his intervention. Rodriguez wasn't finished. He pointed toward a small ribbon that most civilians would overlook entirely. "That's a Purple Heart. She was wounded in combat. And that one next to it is a combat action badge, which means she engaged enemy forces under fire and returned fire herself." The education Rodriguez was providing to the crowd was having a visible effect on their perception of the situation. People who had been eagerly recording what they expected to be an exposure of fraud were now looking uncertain, their phones lowering as they began to understand that they might have been witnessing something very different. Webb, however, refused to back down from his position. "Look, I appreciate the military brotherhood thing, but anyone can research what ribbons mean and coach someone on the right answers. The bottom line is that real veterans don't just show up at comic conventions in full dress uniform. It's inappropriate and attention-seeking behavior." Rodriguez's jaw tightened as he processed Webb's continued accusations. His daughter tugged at his sleeve, clearly uncomfortable with the tension radiating from her father, but Rodriguez was focused entirely on the woman standing calmly in the center of what had become a very different kind of confrontation than it had been minutes earlier. "Tell me about the Kandahar operation," Rodriguez said to Sarah, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear him clearly. It wasn't really a question. It was a test that would either confirm his growing suspicions or reveal that his initial assessment had been wrong. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that Rodriguez recognized as the look of someone accessing memories that were both classified and painful. "Which one?" she asked simply, The two words hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. Anyone creating a false identity would have either claimed ignorance or attempted to bluff their way through with generalities. Only someone who had actually served in Afghanistan during the time period in question would know that the Kandahar operation could refer to any number of classified missions that had taken place in and around that region. The one that didn't happen, Rodriguez replied, using the kind of coded language that veterans of classified operations understood implicitly. Sarah nodded once, a movement so slight that most of the crowd missed it entirely. But Rodriguez saw it, and he understood exactly what it meant. She had participated in operations that were so sensitive they couldn't be acknowledged officially, the kind of missions that existed only in classified after-action reports, and the memories of the people who had carried them out. Officer Chun, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with his inability to resolve the situation, stepped forward again. "Look, folks, we need to wrap this up. The convention center has policies about disrupting other attendees, and this has gone on long enough." But Rodriguez wasn't ready to let the situation end without full resolution. He began examining other details of Sarah's uniform with the methodical attention of someone who understood that every element told part of a larger story. The more he looked, the more impressed and concerned he became. The Pathfinder badge above her ribbons indicated specialized training in reconnaissance and target acquisition. The military freefall parachutist badge confirmed advanced airborne qualifications. But it was the small combat patch on her right shoulder that made Rodriguez's hands begin to shake slightly. The patch depicted a distinctive unit insignia that Rodriguez had only seen in classified briefings and operational planning sessions. It belonged to a joint task force that officially didn't exist, one that handled the most sensitive direct action missions in the global war on terrorism. Soldiers who wore that patch had participated in operations that were too classified to be acknowledged and too successful to be celebrated publicly. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered, loud enough for several people in the immediate vicinity to hear. "Your shadow angel." The use of that particular call sign caused Sarah to stiffen almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a name that appeared in any public records or military databases. It was operational identification used only within the most classified circles of special operations, known only to people who had worked directly with the units that conducted missions requiring that level of security clearance. Webb, who had been growing increasingly frustrated as Rodriguez demonstrated knowledge that far exceeded his own, decided to make one final attempt to maintain his position as the authority in the situation. "I don't care what military nicknames you guys want to throw around. The fact remains that this woman showed up at a comic convention in military dress uniform, which is inappropriate, regardless of whether she earned it or not." Rodriguez turned toward Webb with an expression of such controlled fury that several people in the crowd actually took steps backward. His voice, when he spoke, carried the kind of barely contained intensity that suggested violence was being held in check by pure force of will. "Inappropriate?" Rodriguez repeated, his voice rising enough that conversations throughout the immediate area began to stop as people turned toward the confrontation. "You want to talk about inappropriate? You've spent the last 30 minutes publicly humiliating a combat veteran who has more courage in her little finger than you'll develop in your entire lifetime." The crowd was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that had moved far beyond entertainment or convention drama. Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying to every person within hearing range. "That woman standing there has earned the right to wear that uniform anywhere she chooses, anytime she chooses, for any reason she chooses. She's earned it by doing things that most people can't imagine and making sacrifices that people like you will never understand." Rodriguez's declaration had created a ripple effect through the crowd that extended far beyond the immediate confrontation. People who had been casually observing or recording what they thought was convention Drama were beginning to understand that they had stumbled into something much more serious and personal. The mention of Shadow Angel had also caught the attention of several other veterans who were attending the convention with their families. Military personnel, active duty and retired, had a way of recognizing each other even in civilian settings, and the intensity of Rodriguez's reaction was drawing them closer to investigate what was happening. Among them was Master Sergeant Thomas Chun, no relation to the security officer, who had served with the 10th Mountain Division and recognized the particular tone that Rodriguez was using. It was the voice of someone defending a fellow warrior, and it carried a weight that made Chun push through the crowd to get a better understanding of the situation. Webb, realizing that he was losing control of the narrative he had created, attempted to regain his position by appealing to what he perceived as reasonable skepticism. "Look, I'm not trying to disrespect anyone who actually served, but you have to admit that this whole situation is suspicious. Real veterans don't typically wear their uniforms to comic conventions." "You're right," Sarah spoke for the first time, since answering Rodriguez's questions, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent crowd. "Real veterans typically don't wear their uniforms to comic conventions." Webb's face showed a moment of triumph, thinking that Sarah had just admitted to the fraud he had been alleging. But before he could respond, Sarah continued. "Real veterans typically wear their uniforms to funerals, for their friends who didn't make it home, for their team members who died in places that don't exist on official maps, for ceremonies that honor people whose names can't be spoken publicly." The silence that followed her words was profound enough that the normal background noise of the convention center seemed to disappear entirely. Sarah's voice had carried the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively pay attention. But more than that, it carried something that couldn't be faked or rehearsed. "I wore my uniform today," Sarah continued, "because exactly 4 years ago, on this date, I lost 3 members of my team in an operation that officially never happened. And because their families will never receive the recognition they deserve for their sacrifice, I wear my uniform on this day every year to honor their memory." Rodriguez felt his eyes beginning to burn with tears he hadn't expected. He had heard rumors about operations that matched what Sarah was describing. Missions that had taken place in the shadow spaces between official military action and plausible deniability. The kind of operations where entire teams could disappear from the record, along with any acknowledgement of their sacrifice. Master Sergeant Chun had finally reached the inner circle of the crowd and was studying Sarah's uniform with the experienced eye of someone who had spent decades in military service. What he saw there made him understand immediately why Rodriguez was reacting with such intensity. The ribbon rack on Sarah's chest wasn't just impressive, it was the kind of collection that represented a career spent in the most dangerous and classified corners of military operations. Chun could identify decorations that were rarely seen outside of special operations communities, awards that were given only for actions that took place in environments where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in seconds. But it was the small details that confirmed for Chun what Rodriguez had already recognized. The particular wear patterns on her uniform showed it had been used in field conditions. The way her equipment was positioned reflected muscle memory developed through countless hours of training and operational experience. Even her posture while standing under hostile questioning demonstrated the kind of composure that could only be developed through exposure to genuinely life-threatening situations. Webb, however, was still struggling to process the shift in the situation. "Even if that's true," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had carried earlier, "it doesn't explain why she won't answer basic military questions. If she's really a veteran, she should be able to prove it." Rodriguez turned toward Webb with an expression that made several people in the crowd step protectively in front of their children. "She doesn't owe you proof of anything," he said. his voice carrying the kind of controlled intensity that suggested violence was being held in check by pure force of will. "But since you seem to need education, let me explain what you're looking at." He pointed toward a small ribbon that most civilians would overlook entirely. "That's a Distinguished Service Cross. It's the second highest military decoration for valor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. Less than 1% of military personnel ever receive one." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing that they were receiving information that would fundamentally change their understanding of what they had been witnessing. Rodriguez continued his explanation with the methodical precision of someone conducting a military briefing. The silver star above it means she distinguished herself by gallantry in action against an armed enemy under circumstances involving grave danger to life. The bronze star with V device indicates valor in ground combat. The purple heart means she was wounded by enemy action while serving her country. Webb's face had gone pale as Rodriguez continued cataloging decorations that represented not just military service, but exceptional performance under the most dangerous possible conditions. Other veterans in the crowd were nodding with recognition and growing respect as they understood the significance of what they were seeing. "And this," Rodriguez continued, pointing to a ribbon that even many military personnel wouldn't immediately recognize, "is the Army Commendation Medal with V device, which means she performed heroic actions during combat operations that didn't quite rise to the level required for higher decorations, but were still far beyond what duty required." Master Sergeant Chen stepped forward, adding his voice to Rodriguez's. "Military education session. The Combat Medical Badge indicates she provided medical care under fire. The Air Assault Badge means she's qualified for helicopter insertion into combat zones. And that Ranger tab isn't something you earn by correspondence course." Webb looked around the crowd, realizing that the situation had shifted completely away from his control. Several people who had been recording his accusations were now deleting their videos, apparently recognizing that they had captured something that reflected poorly on everyone involved, except Sarah herself. Officer David Chun, the security guard, was beginning to understand that his attempt to resolve a simple costume dispute had evolved into something far more complex. He could see other security personnel positioning themselves around the crowd, drawn by the gathering and the intensity of the conversations taking place. That's when the convention center's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that changed everything. "Attention convention attendees. We have a medical emergency in Hall C. Any medical personnel on site, please respond immediately to Hall C, Section 12. Repeat, medical emergency in Hall C, Section 12. The announcement was followed by the sound of emergency vehicles approaching outside, their sirens growing louder as they converged on the convention center. Through the large windows facing the parking area, people could see ambulances and fire department vehicles arriving with their emergency lights flashing. For most of the crowd, the announcement was simply background noise, another minor disruption, in a day that had already provided more drama than they had expected. But for Sarah, the sound triggered a response that was so immediate and automatic that it startled everyone around her. Without a word, she began moving toward Hall C with the kind of purposeful urgency that cleared a path through the crowd. Her movement wasn't panicked or rushed, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and expected others to get out of the way while she did it. Rodriguez and Master Sergeant Chun exchanged glances and immediately began following her, their own military training recognizing the response of someone shifting into operational mode. Webb, confused by the sudden change in focus, trailed behind the group, apparently unwilling to let go of his role as investigator, even as events moved beyond his understanding. Hall C was in chaos when they arrived. A middle-aged man had collapsed near one of the vendor booths, apparently suffering from cardiac arrest. His wife knelt beside him, screaming for help while convention attendees stood around in the kind of helpless panic that overtakes civilians when confronted with genuine medical emergencies. The convention's first aid station was located on the opposite side of the building, and the volunteer medical staff hadn't arrived yet. Emergency medical services were en route, but in situations like cardiac arrest, every second of delay reduced the chances of successful resuscitation. Sarah assessed the situation in the time it took most people to understand what was happening. She dropped to her knees beside the unconscious man, her hands immediately going to his neck to check for a pulse while her eyes scanned his color and breathing pattern. "Call out his condition," she ordered Rodriguez, who had positioned himself where he could see her actions clearly. "No pulse, no breathing, cyanotic, approximately 60 years old." Rodriguez responded immediately, falling into the role of medical assistant with the automatic precision of someone who had worked in combat environments where medical emergencies were routine. Sarah began chest compressions with the kind of professional competence that made it clear this wasn't theoretical knowledge, but practical experience applied countless times under pressure. Her positioning was textbook perfect, her rhythm precisely calibrated, and her focus absolute. "Someone get the AED from the first aid station," she called out without breaking rhythm in her compressions. "And clear this area of everyone except essential personnel." Her voice carried the kind of unquestioned authority that made people respond immediately without considering whether they were obligated to follow her instructions. Master Sergeant Chun took charge of crowd control, his own command presence helping to create the organized space that medical emergencies required. "Step back, give her room to work. Everyone with medical training, identify yourselves and assist. Everyone else, clear the area now." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Webb found himself standing at the edge of the cleared space, watching Sarah perform emergency medical procedures with a level of skill and confidence that made his earlier accusations seem not just wrong, but almost criminally ignorant. The woman he had been mocking as a fraud was now literally fighting to save someone's life, using training and experience that couldn't be faked or purchased at a costume shop. A convention attendee ran up with the automated external defibrillator from the first aid station. Sarah attached the leads with practiced efficiency, following protocols that she clearly knew by heart rather than by instruction. "Clear," she called out, and everyone stepped back as the device analyzed the patient's heart rhythm. The machine recommended a shock, which Sarah delivered without hesitation before immediately resuming chest compressions. The defibrillation had restored a weak but detectable heart rhythm, and Sarah immediately began assessing the patient for signs of responsiveness while maintaining her position to resume CPR if necessary. Her hands moved across the man's chest and neck with the systematic precision of someone who had performed triage assessments in environments where making the wrong decision meant the difference between life and death. "Pulse is weak but present," she announced to the growing circle of people who were now watching her work with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for life or death drama on television. Except this was happening in real time with real consequences. "Breathing is shallow and irregular. We need to maintain airway and be prepared to resume compressions." Rodriguez had positioned himself where he could anticipate Sarah's needs, drawing on his own combat medical training to provide support. "Respirations approximately 8 per minute, pulse thready but consistent," he reported, falling into the familiar rhythm of medical teamwork under pressure. The patient's wife had been moved to a nearby chair where a convention volunteer was trying to comfort her, but she kept looking back toward where Sarah was working with the desperate hope of someone whose world had suddenly narrowed to the medical procedures being performed on her husband. "Has anyone gotten information about his medical history?" Sarah asked without taking her attention away from monitoring the patient's vital signs. Medications, previous cardiac episodes, any known allergies? Master Sergeant Chun had taken charge of information gathering, interviewing the wife with the kind of calm professionalism that helped people provide useful details even during emotional crisis. History of high blood pressure. Takes medication for cholesterol. No known drug allergies. No previous heart attacks but has complained of chest pain over the past week. Sarah nodded, filing the information away as she continued her assessment. The patient's color was improving slightly and his breathing was becoming more regular, which suggested that the immediate crisis was stabilizing, but that professional medical intervention was still urgently needed. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and through the convention center's main entrance, paramedics could be seen wheeling in their equipment. But until they arrived and took over patient care, Sarah remained in charge of keeping a man alive using skills that Webb had been questioning just minutes earlier. "Is he going to be okay?" The patient's wife called out, her voice breaking with the strain of watching her husband fight for his life in front of hundreds of strangers. Sarah looked up briefly, making eye contact with the woman in a way that conveyed both professional competence and human compassion. "We've restored his heart rhythm and he's breathing on his own. The paramedics will be here in less than a minute, and they'll have equipment and medications that will help stabilize him for transport to the hospital." The paramedics arrived with the efficient urgency that characterized emergency medical services, wheeling their gurney and medical equipment directly to where Sarah was maintaining patient care. The lead paramedic, a woman with 20 years of emergency medical experience, immediately began assessing the situation. "What do we have?" she asked Sarah, clearly recognizing someone who knew what they were doing based on the organized scene and the patient's condition. Approximately 60-year-old male witnessed cardiac arrest, down for roughly 3 minutes before CPR was initiated. Sarah reported with the kind of precise medical communication that paramedics appreciated. 1 defibrillation delivered. Rhythm restored. Vitals are currently weak but stable. Patient has history of hypertension and hyperlipidemia. No known drug allergies. The paramedic looked at Sarah with the professional recognition that passed between medical personnel who understood each other's training and competence. "Combat medic?" she asked, noting the military uniform and the quality of care that had been provided. "Special Forces Medical Sergeant," Sarah replied, continuing to monitor the patient while the paramedics prepared to take over his care. "Certified in tactical combat casualty care and emergency medical procedures." The information caused several people in the crowd to exchange glances as they began to understand that Sarah's medical training wasn't just basic first aid, but specialized battlefield medicine that qualified her to provide emergency care under the most challenging possible conditions. As the paramedics took over patient care and prepared for transport to the hospital, Sarah stepped back and began cleaning blood from her hands with sanitizing wipes that someone had brought from the first aid station. Her movements were automatic and professional, the kind of post-medical procedure routine that medical personnel performed countless times without conscious thought. Webb stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the man whose life Sarah had just saved was loaded onto the paramedic's gurney and wheeled toward the exit. The patient was conscious now, breathing with the assistance of an oxygen mask, and his wife was walking beside the gurney holding his hand. The contrast between what Webb had been alleging 30 minutes earlier and what everyone had just witnessed was so stark that several people were openly staring at him with expressions ranging from disapproval to disgust. His confident accusations about stolen valor and fraudulent military service had been followed immediately by a demonstration of exactly the kind of life-saving skills that military medical training was designed to provide. Rodriguez walked over to where Sarah was finishing her post-emergency cleanup, his expression carrying the kind of professional respect that one combat veteran shows to another. "That was textbook TCC," he said quietly, referring to the tactical combat casualty care protocols that were standard training for special operations medical personnel. Civilian medical emergency isn't much different from combat trauma, Sarah replied, disposing of the used medical supplies in a container that the paramedics had left for that purpose. The principles are the same. Assess, treat immediate life threats, maintain vital signs until professional help arrives. The convention center had taken on a completely different atmosphere following the medical emergency. Where there had been chaos and panic just minutes before, there was now a subdued quiet as people processed what they had witnessed. The vendor booths that had been temporarily abandoned during the crisis were slowly returning to normal operation. But conversations throughout the immediate area focused entirely on the dramatic rescue. They had just observed. Officer David Chun found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to write an incident report about a situation that had evolved far beyond anything in his training manual. What had started as a complaint about inappropriate costume wearing had transformed into a public demonstration of genuine heroism that made his initial handling of the situation appear grossly inadequate. Convention staff members were approaching the area to assess what had happened and determine whether any additional security measures were needed. The medical emergency had been resolved successfully, but the confrontation that had preceded it was still generating discussions among attendees that suggested the incident was far from over. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the convention center's emergency coordinator, arrived to interview witnesses and gather information for her own report. Walsh was a registered nurse who worked part-time coordinating medical preparedness for large events, and she immediately sought out Sarah to understand exactly what had transpired during the critical minutes before professional help arrived. "Ma'am, I need to get some information about the medical intervention that took place," Dr. Walsh said, approaching Sarah with the professional courtesy that one medical provider shows to another. The paramedics reported that excellent care was provided before they arrived, and I understand you were responsible for that care. Sarah nodded, her expression neutral but cooperative. The patient suffered cardiac arrest. I performed CPR and defibrillation until EMS arrived and took over. Standard emergency medical protocols. Dr. Walsh consulted her notes, which included information she had gathered from the paramedics during their brief handoff communication. They indicated that the quality of care suggested advanced medical training. "Are you a healthcare professional?" "Former Special Forces Medical Sergeant," Sarah replied. "Current emergency room physician, but I was attending the convention as a civilian." The information hit Dr. Walsh like a revelation that recontextualized everything she had heard about the incident. She had been told that a convention attendee in military costume had provided emergency medical care, which had led her to expect either basic first aid or well-intentioned but potentially problematic civilian intervention. Instead, she was speaking with someone whose medical qualifications exceeded her own. Meanwhile, Webb was discovering that his role in the earlier confrontation was becoming the subject of increasingly hostile attention from other convention attendees. Several people who had witnessed his accusations were now approaching him with questions about why he had chosen to publicly challenge someone whose service record was so obviously authentic. "I don't understand what you were trying to accomplish," said Maria Santos, a convention attendee whose husband was deployed overseas with the Navy. "Even if you had doubts about her uniform, why did you think it was appropriate to humiliate her in public?" Webb tried to defend his actions by appealing to the importance of preventing stolen valor, but his arguments were falling flat with an audience that had just watched Sarah demonstrate exactly the kind of skills and knowledge that her military decorations represented. His confident assertions about military protocol and uniform regulations now seemed not just wrong, but offensively ignorant. Master Sergeant Chun approached Webb with the kind of purposeful stride that made people instinctively step aside. His expression carried the controlled anger of someone who had watched a fellow veteran subjected to public harassment based on ignorance and assumption. "I need to understand what you thought you were accomplishing," Chun said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to demanding explanations and receiving them. "Because what I witnessed was the public humiliation of a combat veteran who has more courage and integrity than most people will ever develop." Webb attempted to justify his behavior by explaining his research into military protocol and his commitment to exposing fraudulent claims of military service. But his explanation sounded increasingly hollow to people who had just witnessed Sarah save someone's life using training that couldn't be faked or purchased online. "Your research," Chun replied with barely controlled disdain, "consists of YouTube videos and Google searches. Her training was earned in places where making mistakes meant people died. The fact that you can't tell the difference between authentic military bearing and costume wearing doesn't give you the right to interrogate veterans in public." The confrontation was drawing attention from convention security and management, who were beginning to understand that the incident involved not just a disruptive attendee, but someone who had potentially violated the convention's harassment policies through his treatment of another guest. Rodriguez had remained near Sarah throughout the aftermath, partly out of respect for her service and partly because he wanted to ensure that no one else attempted to subject her to the kind of interrogation that Webb had conducted. His daughter had watched the entire sequence of events with the wide-eyed attention of someone learning important lessons about courage, respect, and the difference between real heroes and people who just talked about heroism. "Dad," she said, quietly tugging on Rodriguez's sleeve, "is that lady really a special soldier like you?" Rodriguez looked down at his daughter, then back toward Sarah, who was finishing her conversation with Dr. Walsh and preparing to return to her convention activities as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "She's exactly the kind of soldier I hope to be someday," he replied, his voice carrying the kind of respect that spoke to something deeper than professional admiration. The crowd that had gathered for Webb's original accusations was slowly dispersing, but the conversations they were having as they walked away suggested that the story would spread throughout the convention and beyond. Social media posts were already beginning to appear, not mocking Sarah's uniform as Webb had intended, but celebrating her heroism and criticizing the harassment she had endured. "Officer," Chun realized that he needed to file a comprehensive report about the incident, but he was struggling to find language that would adequately capture the complexity of what had occurred. A simple disturbance report seemed inadequate for a situation that had involved false accusations against a decorated veteran, followed immediately by that same veteran saving someone's life. Convention security had called for a supervisor to handle what had clearly become a significant incident requiring administrative attention beyond the scope of standard crowd control. Captain Rebecca Torres, the convention center's security chief, arrived with a background in both law enforcement and military service that made her uniquely qualified to understand the full scope of what had transpired. Torres began by interviewing the primary witnesses, starting with Officer Chun and working through the crowd of people who had observed the confrontation from its beginning. What emerged from these interviews was a pattern of behavior from Webb that went far beyond innocent mistake or misunderstanding into the territory of deliberate harassment based on assumptions and prejudice. "Let me make sure I understand the timeline correctly," Torres said, consulting her notes while addressing the assembled group. Mr. Webb approached Captain Morrison unprovoked, accused her of stolen valor without any evidence, refused to accept her military identification as authentic, and continued his accusations even after other veterans confirmed the legitimacy of her service record. Webb attempted to interrupt with justifications about his research and his commitment to protecting military honor, but Torres continued with the kind of professional authority that didn't invite interruption. Furthermore, this harassment continued until Captain Morrison demonstrated her military medical training by saving someone's life, at which point the falseness of your accusations became undeniable to everyone present. The convention's legal team had been consulted by phone, and their recommendation was clear. Webb's behavior constituted harassment that violated both the convention's code of conduct and potentially local laws regarding the public harassment of veterans. More significantly, his actions had been recorded by multiple attendees, creating evidence that could be used in any formal proceedings. Mr. Webb, Torres continued, you're being permanently banned from this convention and all future events managed by this organization. Your registration is being revoked immediately, and you'll be escorted from the premises. Any attempt to return will result in criminal trespassing charges. The decision was met with approval from the witnesses who had gathered to provide statements. Many of them expressed satisfaction that someone who had publicly humiliated a veteran was facing meaningful consequences for his actions. Webb's removal from the convention center was conducted with the professional efficiency that characterized quality security operations, but his departure marked only the beginning of the consequences he would face. Social media posts about the incident were spreading rapidly, with multiple videos showing his accusations followed immediately by Sarah's life-saving medical intervention. The contrast between his confident ignorance and her quiet competence was creating exactly the kind of viral content that destroyed reputations permanently. Sarah, meanwhile, had quietly returned to her original purpose for attending the convention. She moved through the vendor halls with the same understated presence she had maintained throughout the day, examining merchandise and speaking with artists as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But her interactions now carried a different quality, as people who had witnessed or heard about the incident approached her, with the kind of respect usually reserved for celebrities. A group of veterans who had been attending the convention together found her at a booth selling military-themed artwork. They introduced themselves with the quiet professionalism that characterized interactions between people who understood military service from personal experience rather than popular culture. "Ma'am," said retired Air Force Colonel Patricia Hayes, speaking for the group, "we wanted to thank you for handling that situation with the dignity that reflects well on all of us who've served." Sarah acknowledged their thanks with a simple nod, clearly uncomfortable with attention, but understanding that her response to the situation had implications beyond her own experience. "Military bearing doesn't end when you take off the uniform," she replied. "Sometimes civilian situations require the same discipline and professionalism that military service teaches." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Walsh, who approached with an update about the man whose life Sarah had saved. "I just received word from the hospital," she reported. "Mr. Davidson is stable and conscious. The cardiologist said that the immediate intervention he received was absolutely critical to his survival. Without that care, he wouldn't have made it to the hospital." The news that her actions had definitively saved someone's life created a ripple of emotion through the group of veterans surrounding her. They understood better than most civilians the weight of responsibility that came with life-and-death decision-making, and they recognized that Sarah had carried that responsibility flawlessly under pressure. Rodriguez and his daughter approached the group, with the young girl carrying something wrapped in convention merchandise packaging. "Captain Morrison," Rodriguez said formally, "my daughter wanted to give you something." The girl stepped forward with the shyness that characterized children meeting adults they perceived as important. "My dad explained that you're a real hero," she said, holding out her package. "I bought this for my dad, but I think you should have it instead." Inside the package was a small American flag pin, the kind of simple patriotic jewelry that vendors sold throughout the convention. But coming from a child who had watched Sarah demonstrate courage under pressure, it carried emotional weight that expensive decorations couldn't match. Sarah accepted the gift with the kind of gentle grace that revealed another dimension of her character. "Thank you," she said, pinning the flag to her uniform next to her other decorations. "This means more to me than you can imagine." The scene was being quietly photographed by several attendees, not with the invasive excitement that had characterized the earlier confrontation, but with the respectful documentation that people felt was appropriate for witnessing something genuinely meaningful. Master Sergeant Chen had been speaking with convention management about implementing policies to prevent future incidents of veteran harassment. His recommendations included better training for security personnel in recognizing authentic military service and protocols for handling complaints about military uniforms that protected veterans from uninformed harassment. What happened today shouldn't happen to anyone who served their country, Chen explained to the convention director. Military personnel, active duty and veterans, should be able to attend events like this without being subjected to interrogation by people who've never served but think they're experts on military protocol. The convention organization announced that they would be implementing new policies based on Chen's recommendations, including designated staff trained in military recognition and procedures for respectfully verifying military status when legitimate questions arose. More importantly, they established zero-tolerance policies for the harassment of veterans that would result in immediate removal and permanent banning. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah completed her circuit of the convention with the same quiet efficiency she had demonstrated throughout the day. She purchased some artwork, spoke with vendors about their military-themed products, and interacted with other attendees who approached her with respectful curiosity about her service. But the most significant impact of the day's events was visible in the changed attitudes of the people who had witnessed them. Convention attendees were engaging with other military personnel in attendance with greater respect and awareness. Conversations about military service carried a depth and seriousness that reflected better understanding of what that service actually meant. Webb's social media presence had been overwhelmed by comments from people who had seen videos of the incident. Military veterans from across the country were sharing their own experiences with stolen valor accusations and expressing appreciation for Sarah's dignified response to harassment. The incident had become a teaching moment about the importance of respecting veterans and the danger of making assumptions based on ignorance. Near the end of the day, Sarah encountered the wife of the man whose life she had saved. Mrs. Davidson had returned to the convention center to personally thank the woman who had performed CPR on her husband during his cardiac arrest. "The doctors said that what you did saved his life," Mrs. Davidson said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank someone for giving me my husband back." Sarah's response was characteristically understated, but deeply felt. "I'm just glad I was there when he needed help." "How is he doing now?" The conversation continued for several minutes, with Mrs. Davidson sharing updates about her husband's condition and prognosis. The cardiologist had confirmed that the immediate medical intervention had prevented permanent heart damage and that full recovery was expected with appropriate treatment and lifestyle changes. As the convention began winding down and attendees started making their way toward the exits, Sarah prepared to leave with the same quiet anonymity with which she had arrived. But her impact on the day's events and on the people who had witnessed them would extend far beyond the convention center walls. Rodriguez and his daughter walked toward the parking area alongside Sarah, their conversation focusing on the lessons that military service taught about character, responsibility, and the importance of being prepared to help others when circumstances demanded action. "What you did today," Rodriguez told his daughter as they walked, "is what real heroism looks like. Not the movie version with dramatic speeches and special effects, but the quiet competence of someone who does what needs to be done because it's right, not because anyone's watching." Sarah disappeared into the parking area with the same understated presence she had maintained throughout the day, driving away in an unremarkable vehicle that gave no indication of the extraordinary person behind the wheel. But the story of her day at the convention would spread far beyond Portland, becoming part of the ongoing conversation about respect for veterans and the importance of recognizing excellence wherever it appeared. The convention returned to its normal operations, but something fundamental had changed in the attitudes and awareness of everyone who had been present. They had witnessed not just the exposure of ignorance and prejudice, but the demonstration of genuine heroism under pressure. More importantly, they had learned that extraordinary people often appeared in ordinary circumstances, and that the uniform, whether military, medical, or any other profession, represented not just the person wearing it, but the training, sacrifice, and commitment that had earned the right to wear it. 3 weeks after the Portland Comic Convention, the video of Webb's confrontation with Sarah had accumulated over 2 million views across various social media platforms. Military advocacy groups had shared the footage as an example of the harassment that veterans sometimes faced from civilians who confused internet research with actual knowledge. The contrast between Webb's confident accusations and Sarah's subsequent demonstration of life-saving skills had become a textbook case in the dangers of making assumptions about people based on appearances. The incident had prompted discussions at military installations across the country about how veterans were treated in civilian settings. Training programs for security personnel at public events began incorporating modules about recognizing authentic military service and avoiding the kind of harassment that Sarah had endured. Several convention organizations implemented policies specifically designed to protect veterans from uninformed interrogation by other attendees. Sarah herself had returned to her work as an emergency room physician at Portland General Hospital, where her colleagues had learned about the incident through news coverage and social media posts. The story had spread through the medical community as well, with physicians sharing it as an example of how military medical training translated to civilian emergency situations. Her department chief had commended her for representing both the hospital and the medical profession with distinction during the public emergency. The man whose life she had saved, Robert Davidson, had made a full recovery and returned home after a brief hospitalization for cardiac monitoring and medication adjustment. His cardiologist had confirmed that the immediate intervention Sarah provided had prevented permanent heart damage and potentially saved his life. Davidson and his wife had written letters to both the convention organization and the local newspaper, describing Sarah's actions and criticizing the harassment she had endured. Webb's consequences extended far beyond his removal from the convention. His employer, a marketing company that valued its public image, had terminated his employment after the viral videos reflected poorly on their corporate reputation. His social media accounts had been overwhelmed with criticism from veterans and their supporters, forcing him to delete most of his online presence. Legal experts had suggested that his public accusations might constitute defamation. Though Sarah had chosen not to pursue legal action, Rodriguez had used the incident as a teaching opportunity with his daughter and her friends, explaining the importance of respecting people who had served their country and the danger of making judgments based on limited information. His daughter had shared the story at school, where it had generated discussions about heroes, service, and the difference between real courage and the Hollywood version that most children associated with bravery. The convention organization had established an annual award for attendees who demonstrated exceptional character or heroism during their events. The first recipient would be Sarah Morrison, though they expected she would decline any public recognition. Instead, they planned to make a donation to a veterans charity in her name, understanding that she would prefer meaningful action over personal acknowledgement. Master Sergeant Sean had been invited to speak at veteran organizations about the incident and its broader implications for how society treated military personnel. His presentations focused on the importance of creating environments where veterans felt respected and valued, rather than subjected to scrutiny and suspicion from people who had never served. The Portland Comic Convention had seen a significant increase in veteran attendance after implementing their new policies and training programs. Military personnel reported feeling more welcome and respected at events that demonstrated genuine commitment to preventing harassment. Other convention organizations had begun adopting similar policies, creating a ripple effect throughout the entertainment and fan community. Dr. Walsh had incorporated the incident into her emergency preparedness training programs, using it as an example of how medical emergencies could occur anywhere and how important it was to recognize and utilize available medical expertise regardless of its source. The case had become part of her curriculum for training civilian emergency responders. 6 months later, Sarah Morrison stood in the same emergency room where she worked, treating a patient who had suffered a heart attack during a family gathering. As she performed the same life-saving procedures she had used at the convention, she reflected on how that single day had changed more than just one man's life. The incident had sparked a national conversation about how veterans were perceived and treated in civilian settings. Military advocacy groups had used her story to educate the public about the ongoing challenges faced by service members transitioning to civilian life. More importantly, it had reminded people that heroes didn't always look the way movies and television suggested they should. Sarah had received hundreds of letters from veterans, sharing their own experiences with assumption and prejudice. Many had thanked her for handling the situation with dignity rather than anger, showing that military bearing extended far beyond wearing a uniform. Several had been inspired to become more active in veteran advocacy work, turning their own negative experiences into positive change for others. The patient she was treating that day survived, just as Robert Davidson had survived 6 months earlier. As Sarah completed her paperwork, she realized that the real lesson of that convention day wasn't about uniforms or recognition or even heroism. It was about the importance of looking past appearances to see the person underneath and treating everyone with the respect and dignity they deserved until they proved otherwise. Heroes walked among us every day, wearing scrubs, civilian clothes, or military uniforms. The key was learning to recognize them not by what they wore, but by what they did when it mattered most. If this story reminded you that real heroes often hide in plain sight, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know in the comments about a time when you witnessed quiet courage in action. Don't forget to ring the notification bell, because the most inspiring stories are the ones happening all around us, every single day.